So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Alana Gunn, who is an assistant professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Fellow. Professor Gunn has extensive practice in community organizing experiences, working with individuals who navigate criminal legal involvement, as well as the agencies charged with supporting their reintegration process. Her program of research focuses on the ways in which multi-level experiences of stigmatization shape the health and well-being of individuals, particularly women, with intersecting histories of criminal legal involvement and substance use disorders. She's a graduate of Vassar College and holds an AM, MPP, and PhD in social service administration from the University of Chicago. And then we also have Dr. Brandon Del Pozo, who is an assistant professor of medicine and health services policy and practice in the Warren Alpert Medical School at Brown University, a research scientist with Rhode Island Hospital, and teaches addiction policy at Georgetown University. He comes to research from 23 years as a police officer, 19 in the NYPD, and 4 as the chief of police of Burlington, Vermont, excuse me. His research concentrates on addressing the health harms of criminal justice involvement among vulnerable populations, reducing police stigma toward people who use drugs, and utilizing criminal justice touchpoints to link these populations with effective substance use treatment and harm reduction intervention. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the City University of New York Graduate Center, an MPA from Harvard University, and an MA in criminal justice from John Jay College. So now the format for our evening. I'll set the stage with some brief theoretical comments, and then each of our panelists will have a turn to speak about their work related to these issues. Then we'll kick off a conversation between them. And we really do hope that all of you will be part of this conversation. So we are excited to include questions and contributions from the audience. For tonight's discussion, we've decided to use the private chat feature for audience questions. So to submit your question, please submit it as a private chat to me, the moderator, and I will ask the questions for the audience. We encourage you to send your questions to us at any point during the conversation. And now, with no further ado, I will get us started. Just 1 second here. All right, so I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about some theoretical issues that I think can be helpful for thinking about some of the ethical dimensions of this particular topic. So I'm going to introduce a couple of ideas, and I'm not going to go through everything in significant detail. But the first idea is this philosophical view called the communicative or expressive theory of punishment. Now, according to this idea, when we think about law enforcement and criminal justice activities, we should really be thinking about them at least partly in terms of meaning. That is, when we stop, arrest, or imprison someone, we are ultimately saying something. And we should think about our criminal justice activities at least partly in terms of these expressed messages. So what they communicate, what they express. Now, philosophers have proposed a number of different views about, what might be expressed or communicated through our criminal justice activities. So, for example, some have focused on this idea that they might communicate or reaffirm our community's values or moral standards. Maybe they express important social emotions or attitudes toward bad behavior, or they might, things like indignation, condemnation, reprobation, etc. Or they might express the attempt to distance the community from the transgression or perhaps the transgressor. Now, some philosophers have tried to connect these to some of the more familiar justifications or values associated with punishment. things like crime reduction or retribution, for example. But these ideas can also be pursued independently. So why is this expressive dimension important? So first of all, I think that understanding these messages is ultimately going to be important for helping us understand the various problematic meanings that are conveyed through policing, surveillance, and punishment. Second of all, I think understanding this can deepen our understanding of how policing and punishment can contribute to systems of domination and oppression. And I think they can also draw our attention to some important ethical complications or questions that might arise out of some potential conflicts or mismatches that arise out of this communication. Now, ultimately, in order to understand these things, I think we need to depart from a priori theories of what punishment expresses, and instead realize that meaning is something that exists within the world. So it's something that exists, down here in the concrete reality. And ultimately, the meaning of a practice or activity is going to be determined by a lot of things, such as the characteristics of that practice and related practices, the broader social, political, economic, and historical context in which they're embedded, including the prominent ideologies that are behind the creation and maintenance of them, and the experiences of the people who are being communicated with or who are ultimately hearing or understanding these messages. Now, ultimately, I'm going to say that I think that there is often no single meaning, but there's often going to be many interconnected and sometimes conflicting meanings that arise. And to help understand this, this is going to be the second important concept to introduce, and this is the notion of ideologies. So ultimately, I think punishment in policing practices express certain ideologies, and these are the ideologies that are going to be in the background. As I'm understanding them, ideologies are going to be complex, interconnected, and interdependent systems of thought, feeling, and action. So they have a cognitive dimension, an affective dimension, and a behavioral dimension. On the cognitive side, we should think of ideologies partly in terms of things like stereotypes, our background theories, assumptions, heuristics, and biases. On the feeling side, there's going to be general attitudes, emotions, desires, and preferences. And on the behavioral side, these will be both particular individual actions, but then also patterns of actions and norms, and even bigger to bigger institutional structures. Now, it's important to realize that these things are all intertwined and interconnected, so they influence one another. The actions that occur are going to occur because of certain types of thoughts and feelings, and actions can ultimately influence the types of thoughts and feelings that are available or licensed. Additionally, bringing it back to the communicative dimension of criminal justice, we should be thinking about these actions or these concrete manifestations of these ideologies as themselves being expressive. And their meaning comes from their place within that broader web of action, feeling, and thought. Now, understanding criminal justice activities in this way, I think it makes sense to try to understand what are the ideologies that are in the background of our criminal justice behaviors, and then how they might help us make sense of what is communicated by various phenomena related to criminal justice. When we're thinking about what those phenomena are, what are those expressive concrete manifestations? This once again will involve both the big institutional level phenomena, so things like what is the overall size and shape and severity of our criminal justice institutions, and how is this, how are these institutions disproportionately targeted toward different groups of people, but then also individual actions that constitute and support that broader practice. Then thinking about other things like common forms of punishment, things about systematic violence, political behaviors that support our systems of criminal justice, and then other institutional actions. Now, I think that all of these different phenomena are expressive, at least partly because of the relationship to other dimensions of the ideology. And so these are going to be our background thoughts and assumptions about things like what good order looks like, or our stereotypes about different kinds of people, assumptions about us and them, and about one's place in society, as well as cognitive biases. And then these thoughts license different feelings that we might have. So these are going to be sometimes attitudes like dislike, animus, contempt, views that certain people don't matter, feelings like fear, anger, disgust, but then also shame and embarrassment. So thinking both the outer directed and inner directed feelings. And all of these different cognitive, affective, and behavioral things all make sense together. Like they're all intertwined, and it's important to understand them together. Now, really quickly, I think that this helps make a sense of why there can be multiple meanings for, especially when it comes to different people at different places within this ideology. So as a quick example, when we think of laws targeting bathroom use, these types of laws might be understood by a member of the trans community as an expression of animus or contempt. To somebody else, that same law might communicate this assumption or this theory that trans folk are dangerous predators. And that same law might signal to someone like a Proud Boy that harassment of or other types of violence directed toward trans folk is ultimately okay or licensed. So different people get different meanings from these same sorts of laws, from this particular type of law, but these different messages all make sense or are all intelligible in light of that broader ideology that licensed them or that they're connected to. It's also important to recognize that meaning does not equal intention. So ultimately, what we communicate isn't settled by what we are trying to communicate or what we intend to communicate. Just like we can't choose we can choose our words, but we can't choose what those words mean in that context. That meaning is sort of decided for us. And so as an example, how this might, give rise to something within the criminal justice sphere, how a police stop will be experienced is going to be rooted in things like the local circumstances, the broader context, and then the past and vicarious experiences of the person involved, not in the police officer's intentions. So this also gives rise to other sorts of conflicts and questions. We might think about this in terms of conflicts between the values that we think that we hold versus the values that are actually expressed by our behaviors. We can also wonder about the conflicts between an official or an actor within the system and the meanings that they express, both in terms of what are the meanings expressed by the policies that they're following and whether that's consistent with their individual beliefs. And then I think that this also raises questions about, different people and the messages that they're interested in expressing. And we should wonder, how should we even understand the ideology shared by the community and whose values are expressed and whose values are excluded. Now, just to wrap this up, I think that if we're interested in thinking about criminal justice research as a way of trying to promote justice for people who are involved in the criminal justice system, at least partly, I think it's going to be really critical that we understand these different dynamics of meaning and how they're understood, internalized, or rejected by people with different law enforcement and criminal justice experience and exposure. But ultimately, I think this work faces a challenge. And that challenge is that we are all swimming in the same ideological waters. And it can be really easy to miss or fail to recognize how one's work with people whose lives are ultimately deeply impacted by policing, surveillance, and punishment might replay some of these same problematic ideologies and reinforce some of these same problematic ideologies. So, if we're ultimately engaging with members of this community as a problem to be fixed, that replays some of those same ideological issues. We should wonder how research participants' experience of research activities, how these are experienced in light of their other experiences of things like surveillance. And is this understood as another level of surveillance, or could this be? Also, other sorts of experiences of exclusion and inclusion. And then ultimately being mindful that imposing one's own values and interpretations on the experiences of others can reinforce the same problematic message that their perspectives don't matter. So these are just some of the issues that I think thinking about things in terms of communication and expressive meaning can be helpful for understanding the ethics of some of the issues in criminal justice research. And I expect both of our panelists will be sharing their work that also highlights, I think, some of these same ideas. All right, so with that, I will pass it off to Alana.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me see if I can.
And while she's sharing, I just want to remind everybody, please do feel free to include questions, and you can chat them to me at any point during the conversation.
Hi, everyone. So my work primarily explores, partners with communities, particularly of women who have intersecting justice involvement and experiences with substance use and trauma. And I came to study the way we do research really through the READY program. I had an interest before then. I was really interested in how researchers talk about the experiences of women, particularly those who have exchanged sex for survival needs. And so I was already asking questions of ethics, but when I became a part of READY, it really elevated my understanding and added a richness, honestly, to my journey as a researcher. And so, and I'm a purely qualitative researcher. I work with quantitative researchers, but I'm purely qualitative. And so we know, qualitative interviewing can be seen as an empowering endeavor, even therapeutic, which I've found in a lot of my research in terms of how those participating in it spoke about it. It could also be seen as a political endeavor, one in which a researcher engages in this process in order to disrupt or redress biased knowledge. And this is particularly in terms of how we look at communities who are experiencing multiple levels of marginalization, such as the communities that we're going to be talking about this evening. And so for particularly community-based researchers, those researchers who embed themselves within the community, even partner with the community, this process of facilitating one's story is critical, and it's critical for communities that often face multiple forms of surveillance and stigma. And I want to highlight this idea of facilitating one's story as a researcher, because oftentimes we think of research as one who goes in and excavates, gathers data, and then goes in and retells it. But I'd like to argue that our role as community-based researchers is also incredible. It's also really incredibly important for us to think of ourselves as helping ones who engage in our research to tell their story, to facilitate even the way they re-envision their story, and And so the community I'm mainly talking about or predominantly thinking about and speaking about is my work with formerly incarcerated Black women. They're one such community that often face multiple forms of stigma as well as surveillance. So in terms of surveillance and stigma, formerly incarcerated Black women face a myriad challenges on multiple levels, from individual level experiences of illness and addiction and trauma to, to also different forms of community violence, system level kind of institutional forms of oppression, and stigma being these devalued kind of statuses that become attached to their attributes, to their identities, whether that's their womanhood, whether it's their engagement with crime, whether it's the assumption and oftentimes, yes, the engagement in sex in exchange for money, for resources, for one's survival. And particularly if we're talking about the gendered nature of crime and women who find their journeys into criminal legal involvement, we're often talking about moms. So that's another layer of stigma. So here we have all these histories marked of intersectional stigma that's attached to these various kinds of identities. And it's these same challenges that formerly incarcerated Black women face that are attached to stigmas that also make them vulnerable participants in community-based research. So stigma raises incredible ethics-specific concerns as participants we know in research often report perceptions of coercion, exacerbated emotional distress, even experiences of shaming experience within the research process. Now, if we consider Black women's own experiences of intersectional stigma, it's critical to explore how these harms and these experiences of stigma shape their engagement. So how they experience the research process and also how they experience the researcher. I'd also like to say that, as I'm now in a criminology department, I started in social work. I am thinking a lot more at stigma, this judgment, this devaluation, this marking as another form of surveillance and another form of control. So this current study I'm going to be talking about involves 28 women, justice involved women who were incarcerated, who are now on parole. They were released within the last 2 years of their sentence, and they were also engaged in mandated drug treatment. So we have these parallel processes of reentry and recovery from drug use. And in this study, I heavily and welcomed the participation, the insights and advisement of a community advisory board, which was made up of folks with justice involvement, folks who are now leading drug treatment programming, who are now activists, and they played a really important and meaningful role throughout the journey of this study. So just to get into the findings. So the findings are broken up in the sense of women telling me about their experiences of stigma and surveillance that they experience in their journey of life, as well as how they think about stigma and surveillance in the context of research. Because you really have to think of these parallel processes in which one may experience stigma as intersecting, because what they're experiencing out in the world and how they're navigating stigma does shape how they experience the research process. So women, yes, are sharing myriad experiences of stigma and surveillance within the research context that they've experienced outside of the research context. And here are just a few quotes. These POs, so that's a parole officer, these POs are quick to tell you you're out here smoking crack. Or if you wasn't running around after this guy, insert a male name, doing what they do, you wouldn't be here. You know, and so when I hear stories or the retelling of these perceptions of stigma, and particularly in this quote, you know, we're hearing the stigma attached to this devalued women, this devalued kind of womanhood of running after a guy, you know, this stigma of having smoked crack, or this assumption of having smoked crack, you know. So here are these different kinds of stigmas that women are experiencing, and then they're coming into the research context. So we also have another quote: I think Black women are judged more harshly. We are criminals, not like white women. They are looked on different. Innocent. Us, we deserve this. We left our kids to get high. And so this quote brings in even more kinds of intersections. We hear this woman bringing in a racialized stigma of Black women she's a Black woman herself. So she's saying that they experience more judgment than white women, who she perceives to be seen as more innocent, less deserving of her current state in life. And compounding this devalued kind of Black womanhood, this criminalized Black womanhood, we also have this perception of someone who has used drugs and has left their children. So this devalued kind of motherhood. So these are just some of the stigmas that women talked about experiencing experiencing outside of the research context in the research context. Now this gets more to the research context itself. So participants discussed the potential stigmas due to researchers' condescending language and mannerisms. One woman said, well, my stories are not for someone to shame me. So this assumption or belief that there's a potential of being shamed for the stories that she's sharing, you know, these stories of, yes, of trauma, of stigma, of surveillance, and also I would add of women seeking to recover. A lot of these stories were actually of triumph, you know, talking about these testimonies of what they've been through, but also saying, but this is what I'm doing now. This is what I hope to do. This is the way in which I hope to be of service to others. There was a big theme of wounded healing. How can I now, with my wounds, participate in the healing? But at the same time, women talked about this fear of their participation in research possibly leading to being shamed for telling these stories. However, women did talk about the research process as offering an alternative counter space where they could recast their experiences of stigma, trauma, and surveillance. Here's one quote: just want to tell you how I'm feeling. The mental health people think I'm so crazy. I might can't take care of my kid. And then there's another quote: we need to throw it all up. Talk about it like here. So in these quotes, women are framing the research context as an alternative space, a space that's alternative to service provider spaces where they receive services, they're diagnosed. So they're setting up and seeing the research process as an alternative kind of counter space to the kind of judgment of quote unquote being crazy that they feel that they're experiencing within these service sectors, which could lead to them losing their kids, you know, and so that's an incredible fear to hold, that they're saying they don't necessarily feel within a research context. It's an alternative space. And they're also saying this is where we throw it all up. So we throw up our stories, which I found it fascinating how women talked about it as if they were like almost like kind of vomiting. I said that in one of my papers, like they were letting go and vomiting up these harmful experiences. So just the process of telling their story within the research context was therapeutic and helpful and beneficial. So this reframing allows them to imagine themselves as wounded healers in ways that further their recovery, which I heard a great deal, and not only in this study, but in previous studies I've done with women who have been incarcerated. And so here's one quote: "Your ministry is what tried to break you, and your testimony is how you use it." You know, so there was a huge theme. I'm actually trying to start a new paper specifically talking about this idea of the wounded healer. So there was this huge theme of women seeing the research context as allowing them to tell their stories in like this ministry and this journey of using their testimony to help others. So the implications, participants discuss the importance of the researchers sharing of power. So one participant talked about, well, you kept asking my permission and checking in to see if I was okay. So this kind of compassionate kind of researcher who's sharing of the power and consistently creating and cultivating a space where the participants know that their stories are critical and important, and that they have the power to decide whether or not to share them, and also seeing if they're okay. So it really creates an understanding that researchers understand the sensitivity of the stories that they're telling. So another implication, the validating of one's stories of trauma and triumph. And so one woman said, "Even if I'm a hooker, validate me. You made me feel like you noticed my efforts to overcome." So, you know, there's an acknowledgement of a stigma that exists, you know, this devalued state of being quote unquote a hooker. But even in that, she's saying, I deserve to be validated, and I feel as if I'm being validated within this research context, and that's important for me. And I feel as if you are seeing and hearing it and acknowledging my desire and my journey to overcome. Also, researcher vulnerability. And that was particularly talked about in the context of how we share our stories. And it's interesting, I'm thinking about the Ready Talk in July, but how we share our stories, how we talk about our journey to coming to doing this kind of work, and how the women in my study also found that to be incredibly important in a way of connecting and building trust. You know, so one woman said, and the fact that you talk about your work in the community, that's very important. A lot of women talked about, you know, I've seen you in the community. I've heard you talk, you know, in the community, and that was important for me feeling comfortable and safe and coming to this research experience and sharing my story. You know, and so to some extent, it symbolizes the researcher sharing their vulnerability, you know, their vulnerability with the participants, as we are often asking our participants to share their story. And I believe, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And now, Brandon, you can take over.
Thank you very much. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen, or at least hoping that folks can see my screen.
Yes.
All right, great. So that was such a stimulating presentation. What I'm going to do, Stephen asked me to talk about policing and public health and some of my efforts to bridge that. So this is sort of a whirlwind that I'm going to try to get done in about 15 minutes, where I start with some normative discussions, move into the nuts and bolts of some research I'm doing, and then end up with the my Ready project by way of describing it and how it will fill certain gaps. So first, I'd like to thank my funders. I'm supported by the National Institutes of Health on 2 grants. Some of the older research was out of a postdoc and a Cobre Center grant, and the new research is under a K and a R21. So have no conflicts to declare. I'd like to open with this quote whenever I can. I know we don't want this to drag on for too long, but I think this is truly worth reading. So I'll read it actually. Despite these widely acknowledged advances, however, the police continue to project as bad an image today as they have had in the past. In fact, the voices of criticism seem to have increased. The traditional critics have been joined by academic scholars and by some highly placed judges. Certain segments of American society, notably the ethnic minorities and the young people who have only recently acquired a voice in public debate, express generally hostile attitudes toward the police. At the same time, news about rising crime rates and widely disseminated accounts about public disorders, ranging from peaceful protest to violent rebellion, contribute to the feeling that the police are not adequately prepared to face the tasks that confront them. So if I showed this to you, especially in the summer of 2020, but anytime in the past 2 or 3 years, you'd say this was like your curmudgeonly, old-fashioned grandparent, like describing the summer of George Floyd or describing where policing is today. Actually, 2 things of note. This was written under a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health. So this was actually NIH-funded research that came to this. And it was written in 1970. So it was written about 53 years ago. So for as much as we feel like we're living in a certain moment, it also feels like Groundhog Day that we're repeating this moment. So hopefully in our lifetime, we'll get something right so that somebody writes something different in our modern lexicon than the paragraph we just saw. So one of the things I also like to point out is that the New York City Police Department in its charter is explicitly given the mission of guarding public health. It's not a mistake. This has been around since 1961 when the charter was written. You can see here it says guard the public health. It also says they're given the proper protection of human life and health, right? So there's actually a mandate within policing to not only fight crime, but to take a health-oriented approach in doing so. And that seems a bit out of place to some, but I don't think that was put there by accident. I just think we've actually lost sight of that, right? And when you think of it, it's not entirely ridiculous of a concept, right? So when a police chief talks, and I was a police chief for 4 years, they don't talk about, well, I'm going to create the safest one block in the city, even if they're serving certain constituencies better than others. They don't say, I want to create the safest Upper East Side or the safest Beverly Hills or the safest Rodeo Drive or the safest, Back Bay. They say, I want to improve the conditions for everyone in my jurisdiction. I want to lower the roadway deaths, overdoses, violent crime for my entire city, which if you think about it, population health or public health is about improvements in morbidity and mortality at the population level. So it's not entirely incongruous to say that. One of the interesting things though is, I thought, hey, let's ask police what they think about this, chiefs of police, and let's phrase it 2 different ways, right? Let's ask them what they think about public safety. Let's ask them what they think about public health. And one of the things we did in this, and by the way, good luck for anyone trying to get 275 US chiefs of police selected at random to answer a 36-question drug policy survey, but we did it. It was just a dogged effort. So these are the same: reduce death, reduce injury, reduce risky behavior. We framed it as public health, we framed it as public safety, and there was a statistically significant 0.0001 difference in the confidence intervals about their sentiment. There was agreement for both, but the agreement taking a public safety approach, framing it as public safety, was much, much more robust than the agreement calling it public health, where they're asking them about the same thing. So also that little box over here, 49 respondents, which is 37% of the sample for that arm, gave the strongest 7 agreement for a safety-oriented approach. 17.5% or 25, many fewer, gave the strongest level of agreement for health. So some of this is probably just framing and messaging and the worldview of the actors involved, right? Beyond that, though, I think it makes like scientific sense to try to mate up policing with public health, because this psychedelic sideways squid is our criminal justice process. It was written in 1967. I believe that was the Nixon administration, but it was revised in 1997. And we've done a lot of research in the corrections and community supervision space about health and about stigma, right? Plenty in the prison setting itself, a lot of research about stigma, about terrible health outcomes. We've dealt with drug courts and things like that. And in the incarceration space, there's less research about how to improve health outcomes and how to make a difference in the policing space, but it's important for two reasons. One, it's upstream of all of this. It avoids the lifetime stigma of incarceration, of conviction. It avoids the actual harms of going through those experiences, physical and otherwise, mental. And it also reaches an entire population before it gets lost in the mix with several different harms. This also makes sense from a sequential intercept approach, right? There's different intercepts at which you can intervene on the health of people in the justice system, and you want to intervene as early as possible, hopefully prior to arrest, hopefully prior to or during contact with justice actors, and even hopefully before that, right? The community can intervene in a preventive way before you talk about intercept 2, 3, or 4. So it does make sense, right? However, just by way of a caveat, we have the idea that this might not be precisely the right analogy, policing and public health. Evan Anderson and Scott Burris, who are researchers at UPenn and Temple, bring up the idea that maybe doctors are actually more appropriate. Doctors complain about the upstream problems that they have to contend with when people walk into their doctor's offices. They also have a hand in perpetuating some of those with inequitable care. It is all about situational transactions between the doctor and the patient, i.e. the police officer and the person. And doctors create iatrogenesis. They could cause an infection when they operate. They can amputate the wrong limb. They can give you chemotherapy and you lose all your hair. A lot of well-intentioned police interventions cause negative effects as well. So this is a point that they make. And lastly, just by way of curiosity, when policing was trying to get an evidence-based approach, which started in 1998 with Larry Sherman saying we need evidence-based policing, he said we need to take this from medicine, because when I do research in medicine, I find that like doctors consistently ignore evidence-based practices, and it's been very difficult to get doctors to come to the evidence-based trough and get them to drink. Right. So if we think that police are uniquely bad at evidence-based approaches to their work, there is this precedent that evidence-based policing comes from evidence-based medicine, and medicine wasn't always, uniformly evidence-based. So we're just maybe decades behind in policing, but not alone necessarily. I took this to heart as a chief of police. That's me. I had a lot of gray beard just waiting to grow in at the time as a chief of police. But what we did when we were looking at the overdose crisis in Burlington was decide that medications for opioid use disorder were singularly effective, and we wanted to implement them wherever we possibly could, right? That led to, there I am, a 50% reduction. It's associated with a 50% reduction in overdose deaths, saying wherever we can take a public health approach and emphasize medicine over arrest, over citation, over enforcement, we will. And it worked for a while before COVID set in. In practice, narcotics arrest diversion programs are a great public health approach to policing. Chicago has the largest catchment of one in the country. But as Dr. Fisher and Dr. Swartzer noted, it's based on officers using their discretion. And that's where stigma comes in. That's where normative ethics comes in. Officers say in our studies that they said 69% that they have at least some control over the decisions they make to arrest or not. They have control over decisions they make to confiscate things like syringes or unprescribed addiction medication. So understanding why cops make those decisions is important, right? Here's why, according to some of our research. They cite the seriousness of the offense, which again is woven in with stigma as the most important situational determinant, the expectations of their supervisors, right, which could compound stigma or reinforce it as the most important person in that calculus, and the attitude of the suspect, which is a very human thing, But if you are a person who's using drugs, you are not thrilled to be around the police, you want to get away from the police, you are nervous around the police are stigmatizing you, and they'll perceive your attitude often as being a quote unquote crappy attitude and arrest you. So again, stigma plays a huge role in this discretionary decision making. And then when you dive down into stigma, you see that police report substantial agreement with just some standard stigma measures, right? The silver lining is that they do believe, at least 90% agree, that you can overcome addiction. So it's threading that needle away from stigma and towards this belief that people can get out of something like addiction given the right interventions. The end result of this is my successful funding of a 5-year study to dive into, number one, stigma, and number two, the other factors to get police to take a public health approach, a medication-based approach, a non-arrest approach to addiction. Another thing that we did in Burlington was just decriminalize certain addiction medications, buprenorphine. We just said, we are not arresting anyone for it. Larry Krasner, the district attorney in Philadelphia, followed suit. And getting to the bottom of what cops believe about this and why they would support something like this or not, I think is another important public health goal. And the answer preliminarily is they don't exactly know what to make of it, right? We asked, this is in St. Louis County, which has a diversion program that doesn't get a lot of uptake. We said, does addiction treatment with medication reduce a patient's criminal activity? 80% either gave what I believe is the wrong answer. It does. They said, no, we disagree, or just didn't know, right? So there's a huge knowledge gap in this that needs to be filled to empower police, at least to give them the evidence to make the right decision about this. When we asked those chiefs of police what they think, and we framed it two ways, are people using Suboxone to use a less dangerous drug than heroin or fentanyl? Are they managing their own addictions outside of a formal care setting using Suboxone? Respectively, 50% and 36% just didn't know, right? So again, there's a knowledge gap to fill to empower police to make the, ought implies can. We need to give them the ability to make these evidence-based decisions. And I stress that the everyday American also doesn't know much about the role of medication in getting people out of cycles of addiction. So police are no different than the average American. They just have a hell of a lot more responsibility when it comes to getting this right. So we also have a R21 grant to look into that. Stay tuned. I'm going to run this funding out as long as I can. Ask for a no-cost extension. I'll have the answers for you in 3 years. Another interesting thing to think about, and I think this has profound ethical implications, is there's emerging evidence, and I'm a co-I on this study, that police seizures of drugs proximately increases subsequent overdose in the neighborhood where the police seize the drugs, right? So this is a study out of the CDC. I'm a co-investigator on it, where police go, they make those arrests, they think they're doing the right thing, they think they're taking drugs out of the community. What they're actually doing is destabilizing people in a way that makes them take riskier behaviors and go to another dealer who they don't know what they're selling them, to take a different formulation of illicit drugs and engage in riskier behavior to stop withdrawal to take the drugs. That's the operating hypothesis. And again, there is quantitative proof of this that's been published, but this is under review right now, so please don't cite or circulate it. But looking at thousands of drug seizures by police in Indianapolis over the course of a few years, we find a statistically significant association of 7, 14, and 21 days with fatal and non-fatal overdose and naloxone administration within several hundred meters of where the drugs are seized. So, you have this practice that we all Americans believe is the holy grail, get the drugs off the street. It's actually exacerbating overdose, right? So you saw some studies that I did where I'm asking police what they think, where I'm intending to get to the bottom of what police think, and leave it to Reddy to say, hey, what are the ethical implications of that type of research? Well, research into the ethics of police research is under-researched, that tongue twister. And so one of the intentions that we have here is to ask police, because they are skeptical of research, why don't you participate in research? Why aren't you as fulsome as you could be? Why do you engage in social desirability bias and giving certain answers when we really want to know, what your true thinking is? And so without belaboring it, there is a study underway as an adjunct to my other two studies to look at that. And if there's one graphic that gets to the bottom of that, it's this one, which is there's two traditions in research. There's the in criminal justice, the critical tradition, Alana brings out very, very, very insightful things that are fairly critical of criminal justice and the police, not quite critical, in fact, right? Then there's this whole other branch of criminal justice research, which is, hey, police, let us study you so we can tell you how to do what you're doing better, empower you to improve your practices. And they're very, careful about not being too critical to enlist the help of the police. Some might say to really help the police, you need to really wholesale a lot of this reform, take it much, much further. Alana might say, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but hey, if that's all you're doing is hoping the police do their quote unquote job better, you're not really getting to the heart of what's wrong. But I would say that if a lot of folks from the critical tradition came into the police setting and said, I want to interview you, they'd say, no, we don't feel comfortable, right? No, you're just going to criticize us. My chief might force me to participate, and in which case I'm just going to give you desirable answers. So threading this needle and understanding the ethical sensibilities of police and engaging in research, I think is understudied but critical, and it would help merge the access that the police administration research tradition gets, but get to some of the problems that the critical tradition so aptly points out. That's the holy grail of all this, right? So this is the specific aim. I won't bore you with it. I will give one plug if you liked any of the normative stuff I was talking about, in about 2 months, there will be a book out from Cambridge University Press that goes on ad nauseum to the tune of 270 pages about the ethical bases of policing as a matter of political philosophy, and it ends with calling for an alignment between the goals of policing and public health. So thank you very much. I see I'm only 2 minutes over, so I will relinquish the screen, and I hope we can get a good conversation going.
So I guess I just want to start with a weird abstract question between the two of you. So on the one hand, so Alana's presentation, I really appreciated the focus of your work is thinking about the work with these individuals as individuals, and the potential, therapeutic value of this individual work, and perhaps disruptive value of this work too, but it's really focused on those individuals and those relationships. And then Brandon, your work is very big, super structural, thinking about the systems and public health in general. And so I'm curious what you think about what either of your perspectives has to say to that other perspective. How can thinking about the personal in the way that you're thinking about those relationships help us better understand the bigger structural things, or how can the bigger structural things help us do better with those individuals?
Let me see if I can tackle this awesome question. I will say, so I absolutely do focus on women's individual experiences with trauma and surveillance and stigma, and how that shows up within the research process, but I'll also say that even particularly with my emerging work, my Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant, we're looking at how community residents on the west side of Chicago experience policing, their interactions with police. And while I do look at one's experiences of trauma, yes, and one's experiences of surveillance, one thing that has been coming out of our data is that folks on the individual level, yes, are talking about how they're navigating justice involvement, how they're navigating their interactions with police and anticipatory fears, but they're also talking about a desire to work with police, a desire to see them partner in their community, and do leagues and be embedded in the community. They're also talking about community violence, and they're talking about experiences that they have at gas stations, interpersonal forms of violence, and they're also talking about the ways in which they want to help and be a part of helping these systems, policing systems, work in their communities to help them to feel safe. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do see the ways in which understanding how individuals are navigating stigma and surveillance and trauma, which is not just individual level illnesses, but traumas caused or exacerbated by system involvement. I do see how that speaks to the ways in which these individuals would like to see systems assist them in ways that feel more safe, that feel more protected, to help them to be able to navigate not just their illness experiences, but also their communities. Because yes, particularly in the city that I'm living in, yes, community residents are talking about incredible fears about the communities that they're living in safety, and so I'm not sure. I could probably try to work a little harder to answer your question, but maybe as we go on, I'll say, wait a minute, I can add something, but I'm gonna stop there.
That was great. Thank you. Brandon?
Hi, yeah, I'm just looking at something, debating whether I should share the screen. Sorry. So one of the things that, I just couldn't find the right table, but I have a study that I just got a nice revise and resubmit on that compares the danger of living in the most beleaguered zip codes in Chicago with and Philadelphia with being randomized to combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. And you are 3 times more likely to be shot and killed or wounded just living in certain zip codes in Chicago as a military age male than serving in combat in Iraq. And so I say that to say, Alana talks about the trauma and the fear, like that's real. And what I find most interesting is that, that in and of itself is a tragedy, but the police are dealing with that too, right? They're seeing that death, they're seeing that community, they're seeing, I want to help these folks, but then sometimes my hands are tied, sometimes they don't trust me. And then they're also just dealing with the trauma firsthand. And I wanted to use that as a wedge to say, like, in the way that, we have tremendous sympathy as researchers towards the people enduring these conditions of addiction, of overdose, of fighting to keep their children, of fighting to keep a roof over their head. The police don't have it as hard in many ways. They just don't, right? They have good, stable employment. They have a good retirement to look forward to. They have excellent healthcare, but they're not like just scot-free, not dealing with these things. They're also fairly traumatized too. And I was talking to some cops in Harrisburg a few days ago at length. We actually, since I was a retired chief of police and street cop, instead of like going to lunch secretively, they brought me down to under the bridge where they take their lunch break. And we had this hour-long conversation where they said, and Harrisburg has some rough spots, dealing with addiction and crime. Like they're like, tell us what to do. Like, if you can show us something that works, we'll do it. Like, we know the community just doesn't want to get arrested all the time. We know that, like, we're really disliked in some ways. If you can show us, and these are cops saying, and one of them said this very fairly conservative cop said, the war on drugs is a failure. I just don't know what else to do. And so getting them to open up that way, I think, like, showed me a ray of hope, because I was sort of like skeptical of their willingness to take a professor, even if I was retired, on a ride along. But I think that, like, in the way that, like, there's this 3-way trust gap, you have researchers trying to get information from the community and the cops, neither of which necessarily trust the researchers. And then you have the police and the community with distrust among themselves. And so, I don't know, I don't want to just say it's kumbaya, but to the extent that we can somehow bridge those gaps, there is hope.
I think this ties nicely to an audience question. So how might this conversation differ if, instead of defining or centering, say, the crime of drug use or possession, we saw drug use and other potentially harmful behaviors, manifestations of trauma, marginalization, et cetera, as health issues? Or if we discussed the harm that some people and systems commit against other people as harm rather than crime, and discussed holding people accountable or addressing or reducing harm versus punishing them. Thoughts about that? To expand a tiny bit, there's a little bit more. So the audience member says, I have personally observed that when they partner with law enforcement, then public health, social work, medicine wind up becoming more like cops, more punitive.
Yeah, I
rather
can
than
speak a little bit to that. I just want to give Alana a chance to go, so please.
I am still thinking, but as I heard the question or thought, I thought our restorative justice, you know, this idea or this model, this way of seeing crime as harm that the one that is doing the harm has also experienced, the ways in which they've been harmed, and then thinking of it as, well, how do we mend these harms? How do we amend, and how do we heal? How do we heal these various harms that have been done to the community and individuals? And, you know, I mean, I absolutely can see and absolutely agree that this construction, this disruption actually, of not seeing these activities, these engagements, these behaviors that often are embedded in one's experiences of multi-system harms as not a crime, but as one who also has experienced harm and is now engaging in harm to our communities and individuals. So I see the importance of the framing and how that can create a different approach or way of partnering with policing systems or partnering with communities. But I also heard towards the end of the comment of a critique of this partnering with well, particularly social workers partnering with policing systems, and that's definitely a threat, an emerging threat, and understanding that sometimes these emerging partnerships lead social workers who have their own identity, who have their own code of ethics, professional ethics, to then model or take on identities of those who are surveilling, you know, and we're also talking about how surveilling looks in the context of service agencies. So that this new, well, I wouldn't say new, but this greater attention to surveillance within service systems and surveillance once social workers are then actively partnering with police, and how this becomes an extension of the web, the carceral web. You know, it's this, I don't know. I mean, there's a growing body of understanding and evidence and stories around this. And I think that's important also. I don't think I really had an answer. Brandon, take it away.
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna take the opportunity to share the screen for a second, because whoever wrote that question, I want to give him a high five or a slap on the back. I think it's a great question. One of the things that we have to understand, or at least contend with, is the government is a coercive institution, and you can't fully escape the government. Like that is the definition of the government, basically. Is like, and supposedly there's consent and equity and the ways in which they can coerce, but I can't solve that problem right now. But I do want to just show this one thing. Part of this, I love the idea of changing the characterization of these things as crimes or deviance and talking about them as diseases and health issues. So one of the things policing needs to get away from is measuring its success in terms of arrests made, convictions secured, drugs seized, guns taken off the street, but really be held accountable to go all the way downstream to to look at the health outcomes of what they're doing, right? If you have the right idea about seizing guns, if you have the right idea about making arrests or whatever your problem is, it should increase or improve the health downstream, right? People should be living longer, healthier lives. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing good policing. You're just chasing the wrong endpoints. And the second thing that policing needs to start doing is measuring its iatrogenesis. Like doctors, I had to argue, a doctor gave me an infection after a surgery once, and I had to argue with, I said, I can't, I'm in extreme pain. I have a fever and my lymph nodes are swollen. I have an infection. And the doctor didn't want to believe it because he was held quite accountable for causing infections in his surgery. Police have gotten a pass on negative outcomes, and it's been up to researchers in the critical tradition to constantly be pointing out the negative effects, and police, like, frankly, like denying a lot of it. So two things are: number one, like reframe the outputs and metrics and measures of policing away from crime, away from enforcement, and towards health. That'll, if we demand that, that'll change practice, hopefully, or agitate towards it. And then hold police accountable for properly measuring the negative effects of what they do. I think those are two good steps in at least the right direction. And as far as the coercive nature of even social work, like, great point, whole other hour and a half discussion.
So shifting the conversation slightly. So one of the things I really appreciated, Alana, about your presentation is, like, so I liked the way that you described it in terms of, like, you're trying to dig up these stories, or I can't remember the specific word that you used. But, you know, this brings up the potential of extracting, like having an extractive relationship with these people. And I really appreciated that a lot of the things that you were saying about, you know, sharing your own vulnerabilities and things like that, developing these relationships, are ways of preventing the research agenda from just being extractive, right? But then there's this question from the audience that I thought was really fascinating. So in expressing researcher vulnerability to build trust, how do we know and establish appropriate boundaries? How do we ensure that we are not emotionally exploiting participants in sharing our own vulnerabilities?
That is a great question. I would say, that when I share how I came to doing this work, I really try to embed it in giving an understanding of why I have this commitment, what built this commitment, the years of working with community service agencies, years of going to the prisons, doing groups with women inside, hearing their stories of shame and trauma, and trying to and desiring recovery, even desiring to be moms, to reconnect. So I try to root it in my partnered experiences, my collaborative work, less rooting it in sorrow. I don't know how to say it, but it's less rooted in, well, you know what, but I want to push back against that, because I do see where empathy matters and compassion matters. And, I don't share this often, but I've had experiences in interviews where a woman was telling me a story that was, that felt painful. And I saw her being emotional, and I've shed a tear before, and I found myself feeling bad or feeling ashamed of showing emotion, even slight emotion. But I've had women say to me that it was in you showing emotion that I felt that you were connecting with my story. Thank you for hearing my story and not sitting there stoic as if I just said I'm gonna get a pizza from the store. Thank you for thinking that my story was worthy of a tear, that it mattered, that I've experienced trauma. So I'm of two minds. Yes, I want to, yes, I want to show vulnerability first and foremost through just telling my story and my commitment and investments throughout the years to helping women. However, I have seen how compassion sharing and emotion sharing has been received positively, but I see where absolutely we should be mindful of not being exploitative, yeah. And I think that also speaks to the work needed to partner with folks in the community, show your face in the community, understanding the community needs, getting to know the population and community that you want to study, having a relationship, because if you don't have a relationship and you come into an interview and you end up showing emotion, it could be received much different than someone who's built a relationship, in the community and demonstrated the ways that they have invested in trying to promote change and transformation. So I'm of two minds, but I do think absolutely leading with your investments, demonstrating the ways in which you've shown a commitment through your work, through your partnership and collaboration is what I absolutely desire to lead with, yeah.
It's so interesting to hear Alana talk, because I'm trying to think about how to put a finer point on it. And there's, I think, a difference between creating trust and creating obligation. And when you create trust, you get like a voluntary sharing of information. But then you can tell when you're using your experiences or you're emotionally appealing to someone in a way that is like creating a strain. Like, I really would rather not participate or talk about this, but like, gosh, because of all the things they said, I feel like I should. Like, that's when it goes too far. And I don't know where to draw the line. And I don't know, if some of it is even unknowing. But I think that the good rule of thumb, based on what Alana said, as I deal with this at the beginning of my qualitative research career, is create trust, demonstrate commitment, but don't use your emotional leverage to create obligation that they would, for something that they wouldn't otherwise do if they had like explicit consent. Consent is not just at the beginning of the interview where they sign the form. Consent is at every answer that they're giving. And so that was super stimulating to think about. Thanks, Alana. And I will say one other thing. Chiefs of police wrote more than one on the survey. Please let us know, like, we answer these things all the time in sum and substance. Like, no one ever gets back to us. That's extractive. So it was like, can you please tell me what you find out? Right. And that was very touching to have like this big boss chief of police just writing like, please, can you tell me what happens with this? Right. And I think we often we're happy to publish, and then we forget about the people who give us the ability to publish, give us the data.
Yeah. Wow.
So this is another fun question. I don't know if either of you have thought about this, but this is directed at Alana. So I'm a dancer, and lately we've been talking about sharing stories as dancers and as artists, and the role art has in social justice and giving voice to the voiceless. As a social justice worker and researcher yourself, what do you feel about the role that art has in socio-political issues in a society that tries to separate the art of human expression from the human experience? Is there a space for us to bring art into social justice in a way that is effective? Or how might the new generation create that space?
Oh my goodness.
Any thoughts?
This individual, I don't know if you've been Googling me, but I'm studying to be a dance therapist. I am studying to be a dance therapist. I have a background as a therapist, a clinician. I used to dance myself, and when I was in New York City, I started in the alternate route to dance therapy program about 4 or 5 years ago. And so I absolutely believe in and validate the power of movement, of dance, and of art as a form of expression, of release, of resistance, And I absolutely believe it has a place in trying to create justice, trying to promote and advance justice for folks who are experiencing myriad forms of oppression. I think on an individual level, dance and movement is therapeutic. There's absolutely a lot of research on mind and body connections, and the power of that, and how trauma is embodied, it's experienced within one's body, and how dance and release can be healing. But I also see how dance and art could be a form of expression that honestly many underprivileged and marginalized communities don't have access to, that can be powerful ways for them to express and ways to communicate. And so part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant that I received, where we're talking to community members about the experiences with surveillance and policing, is using a photo voice method where we're asking folks to take photographs about their families, their perceptions of their family experiences, their communities, the way they view the police. And we're talking through these photos with them, and then we're gonna create an exhibit of their photos and with their stories. And I very much see photo voice as a form of art. And I just received a smaller grant because they're gonna build a website in order to have a place where these stories and photos can live. And so I see this as art, and so I absolutely believe art, and particularly for your question, dance. Yeah, wow, that's fun. That's so interesting. Yes, so I absolutely see the power and importance of dance. And I was actually looking at an ad at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and their dean put on Twitter, we're looking for professors and researchers who have a focus on arts-based social justice to come and do this kind of work and research here. So I definitely think that, yeah, this is emerging. Yeah.
That's absolutely lovely. So Brandon, at what point in the conversation you had, contrasted the critical perspective of research versus I don't know if you gave a name to it, but maybe the friendlier perspective on this type of research. And a member of the audience wants to know, like, if you think that your work with the police officers is a lot easier because of your background as a former police officer and as a former police chief, and if that's perhaps part of the reason why they're willing to talk with you and open up with you and work with you in a way, in addition to the friendlier versus critical dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's called like the police administration tradition, which is not as illuminating as the critical tradition label, because I guess they call it that because it accepts the tenets of the bureaucracy, it accepts the bureaucracy's main goals, and then it just dives in and tries to help them improve it or do it better, rather than like shift the practice on its axis, which is what a lot of the critical tradition does. And sure, I mean, it's tough. Like I have this thread. By the time I left policing, I wasn't thrilled with a lot of the critics, but I also wasn't thrilled with policing. I had a lot of I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times saying cops need to stop shooting people with knives as often as they do. There's no reason for it. And I was the most bad, vitriolic, like hostile responses I ever got to anything I wrote were from cops about writing that op-ed. They said, you're just going to get us killed. You don't care. So it's a reminder that, like, if you're just friendly and open-minded, and not open-minded, if you're friendly, hey, I was a cop, let's get together and do some research, like, you'll get more access, but you have to be like true to your convictions too. And sometimes I worry that my experience has two problems, one or three. One, I know the answer in my mind, and all the questions I'm writing and the questions I'm asking are like biased towards what I think is the right answer from 23 years of experience. That's bad research. Number two, the people talking to me, I've had this happen in interviews. They go, oh, well, Chief, what I'm about to say. And I'm like, no, I want you to say it. But they'll figure I must know the answers already. And then the third is like, you need to be properly critical. Like, I think the critical tradition misses out on a lot of the potential value and some of the demonstrated value of policing. And then the administration, I say, and I hope I mean, so Alana's working in a criminology department. I'm waiting till I get burned by this, but I think by what I'm about to say, so many criminologists give the most exquisite answers to the wrong questions. And I see you nodding if you kind of know what I mean. And I don't want to, just for the sake of publishing and getting access, I don't want to be like getting the best answers to the wrong questions. So I didn't answer the meta question you asked, Stephen, but I hopefully I acknowledge its complexity and added some wrinkles. I don't know.
Wrinkles.
Another question. So how do we navigate maintaining trust with stigmatized research participants after study completion? Might we be setting participants up with unreasonable expectations if they decide to participate in a different study with a researcher that doesn't take an affirming and vulnerable approach?
Wow. So let me see if I understand the question, particularly the latter part of it. So if we create research spaces, doing community engaged research where we're operating with tools of anti-oppression, with an understanding that folks are coming in with experiences of trauma, so we need to share power within, and create agentic spaces. Are we not presenting an ideal of research that they may not experience in future research encounters?
Yeah, that's how I'm understanding, especially since it seems like some of the subjects or participants that you had described had prior experiences that were very different.
Absolutely. It's funny. I'm in the middle of tenure, and I saw one of my review letters, and it was interesting to hear them say how this is what we think of research, however, Dr. Gunn is finding all these other really rich kind of finding in terms of ways that research could be therapeutic. And so, yes, that risk does exist of researchers participating in our studies and having these transformative experiences, feeling safe, but then going on to be to now have this sense that, oh, I could be a part of research, I could help this knowledge production, or I can get my story out there, and then and then meeting researchers that don't provide that same space. I think that's why it's important for us community-based researchers, those who have an anti-oppressive lens, to keep writing, talking, and talking to other researchers about the importance of the way in which we engage folks, the way in which we participate and create research spaces, so that there's a thread of understanding that, yes, this isn't an excavation process. We're not going in to get this data, get these stories, and then report it in a journal. There's meaning making happening here. So us continuing to write about the way in which to do research, the way in which that we could create safe and cultivate healthy spaces within the research process, and talking about it, because I realize that there, even when I look at the folks in my department, they're not writing about how we do research. They're not, and I'm thankful for Ready, that I was like, oh, wow, this is a whole another area of research that I want to be a part of, the way in which we conduct work. And so us continuing to do that kind of writing is incredibly important. But I also am thinking, I do think that as folks participate in studies, such as the ones we are doing, they also can develop a more nuanced understanding of what to look for with researchers. So have your researchers taken time in the community to get to know the community needs? Is the researcher asking your advisement on study questions? You know, does the researcher have a community advisory board? You know, so I think there's a way in which those who make decisions on whether or not to participate, they could come to understand what feels like a safe study to be a part of, you know, because even in the research I'm doing now, the photo voice study, our community members are talking about the ways in which they think research should be done and what looks like and what feels like good research, what feels like safe research, what feels like caring research. So let's not rob, you know, our participants of the capacity to say this doesn't feel like safe research. You know, this doesn't feel like the kind of context I want to tell my story in. You know, I'll pass on that. You know, I don't know. I just thought of that. What do you all think?
That it makes me excited. it
But yes, the risk
Yeah.
does exist. Yeah, absolutely.
I think we have time for maybe one, potentially two more. Brandon, as you're thinking about policing and public health, have you thought about the international comparisons here? Have you done any work here? So do other countries address public health or have an idea of policing and public health in this
Yeah,
way?
no, that's a great question. I see we're running short on time. So 2 or 3 things. One, I think like I'm part of the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association, and practice notwithstanding, England, basically the UK, like is several years ahead on this. They have some really thoughtful, methodical working papers about policing and public health. They take it seriously as an academic subject. When you look at like the formative research, Mark Moore from Harvard really wrote the first like journal paper about policing and public health in the 90s. Then there was in the US a huge gap. And then you see like a spurt of scholarship really coming out of like Western Europe. But personally, I'm fascinated by the Portuguese experience of decriminalization because America now has Oregon that's decriminalized, Washington that wants to decriminalize, Vermont has a bill, and everybody's talking about police reactions. The police are bristling. Nobody has gone to I defy, if anyone finds it, send it to me. I'd love to see it, but I haven't found any research of anyone in the English language asking the Portuguese police, what have you made of working in a decriminalized drug environment for the last 20 years? Ask the senior cops, what was it like to go through the transition? Ask the junior cops, what's it like just being sort of born into it? And so I have I promise Celia, I'm going to get the MRP done. That takes priority, I know, but I have a little tranche of money to go over to Portugal and ask Portuguese cops what they think of what we here call like the most progressive public health approach to addiction that we know of in the West. So again, like it's all in the out years. Stay tuned.
All right, so that is time. I just want to really thank you both. This was really a fabulous, really exciting conversation, and so many just wonderful, great ideas. So thank you so much.
I loved it.
Thank you, everyone, for the awesome questions and